Give this some thought for a while. How far would you go to take the life of another person? What would that person have to do to get you to take a chance on everything and exact the ultimate price in retaliation? You have an option when you watch this video. You are free to disregard the questions I just posed and continue as if nothing of the kind will ever occur. However, Vitaly Kaloyev, a Russian architect and family guy, had limited luxury in 2002. Just a few seconds ago, I posed the same query, and it slammed down at his feet with the force of a free-falling jumbo aircraft. And the response he finally gave 2 years later stunned the entire globe. Tragic events forced Vitaly Kaloyev to the breaking point, leading him to carry out one of the most contentious murders in modern history. A homicide produced sharply divergent responses, dividing public opinion into two factions. Was Vitaly Kaloyev's killing justified? We will examine Vitaly Kaloyev's contentious, vindictive, and utterly terrible life today. Vitaly Kaloyev would point to this point in history if you asked him when his life began, in the comfortable darkness of a Russian theater in September 1989. And if you asked him when it ended, he would lead you to the El Prat International Airport Arrival Lounge in Barcelona on July 2, 2002. Vitaly Kaloyev, one of the top architects in his district, had already established a successful career before 1989. He owned his own construction business and was involved in designing and constructing 100 homes in his neighborhood, including a large 3-story red brick mansion of his own. This was the Russian version of the American dream, if there was one. Still, something was lacking. Family. Everyone who knew Vitaly described him as a driven and hardworking individual who threw himself wholeheartedly into any endeavor he chose to commit his time and energy. And it was this almost neurotic devotion to his passions that caught the eye of Svetlana, the woman he would later marry, and a professional with an equally intense love for her work. Meetings for business brought Svetlana and Vitaly together. Vitaly was amazed by Svetlana's professionalism and fell deeply in love when he discovered she was also funny. Without any delay, he proposed a date for the movies. Sometime in December, in the comfortable darkness of the movie theater we had discussed before, Vitaly realized that he had found the person he would spend the rest of his life with, his soulmate. Fortunately for him, Svetlana thought the same thing about him. They decided to start a family after getting married. Vitaly was a very busy man, but that didn't mean he would be a bad husband or father. He cared deeply for Svetlana and the family they were beginning to create. He and Svetlana shared these same ideals once more. Konstantin, their first child, was born in 1992. Vitaly followed through on his promise and gave his son his full attention. In the neighborhood, Konstantin was dynamite. He was vivacious, adored the great outdoors, had a deep fascination with science and dinosaurs, and had extraordinary potential for chess, a game in which his father was also an expert. Vitaly once promised to give the young Kaloyev a telescope when he begged his father for one on one of those occasions. However, due to circumstances beyond his control, the elderly Kaloyev could not fulfill this commitment. Then tiny Diana, the second child of Vitaly and Svetlana, arrived. Svetlana will tell you that Diana came into the world due to her vow to God. She looked forward to having a daughter once Konstantin was born. She prayed and went to her local church for years. Her wishes came true in 1998, when little Diana was born, capping a grueling 6-year wait. Their kid was a bright, lovely girl who loved her father unconditionally. Diana showed her love by learning her father's phone number by heart and making long phone calls when he worked for 2 years in Spain, a few years after Diana was born. The contract, as mentioned earlier, position originated from a need. Vitaly was different from the type of man who traveled abroad for employment. Not only was there no reason for him to, but he didn't like the thought of being away from his family. However, he had encountered hardships. Not long after little Diana was born, Vitaly fractured his leg while working in a pit. He had to miss multiple projects due to this mishap, which required him to take months off. He also suffered and eventually lost his construction company due to the harsh, volatile nature of the construction industry. Vitaly lost his job and had no source of income by the time his leg healed. Therefore, Vitaly had to accept a 2-year job offer to assist in building a mansion for a wealthy Russian in Spain. The work would expedite his economic recovery. Thus, in 2000, Vitaly moved to Spain. His son was 8 and his daughter was only 2 then. Vitaly had to make a complex but essential choice. His 2 years away from home were lengthy and he experienced homesickness. He always wanted to be with his family, even though he would visit them on weekends and holidays. Time was passing quickly and his children were growing up. But he took comfort in the regular phone calls from his daughter, who had learned her father's number and would spend hours telling him everything about her day and repeating nursery rhymes. For Vitaly, they were his mooring moments. Thus, 2002, when his 2-year employment agreement ended, Vitaly decided it would be the ideal opportunity to make up for missed time by taking his family on a holiday to Spain. He spent a lot of time organizing the trip. He would take his science-loving 10-year-old son to see the enormous dinosaurs at the Museo Paleontológico de Cuenca in Spain. He was sure his spouse would appreciate strolling around Miramutra's verdant botanical gardens. And his daughter? He knew Diana's one desire was to be with her father. So Svetlana processed and got their visas. Arrangements were made and Vitaly waited impatiently for his family to arrive. Svetlana had already sold out of her first flight. Summertime is when most people take their holidays worldwide. Additionally, Spain was among the most well-liked and reasonably priced travel destinations for Russian citizens. Thus, the journey would have to wait until midday on Monday, July 1st, 2002. It was then that Svetlana's travel agent called. There were still seats available on an impromptu charter flight to Barcelona that evening. Its scheduled departure from Moscow was in just 3 hours. This was a last-minute miracle for Vitaly and Svetlana, who had anticipated it to be just another ordinary flight like all the others. Thus, Svetlana purchased 3 tickets for herself, Konstantin, and young Diana for Bashkirian Airline Flight 2937, a Tupolev Tu-154-passenger plane. They hurried to board at Domodedovo Airport. Even if Svetlana had some residual concern, one can only assume that, looking back, she felt secure and reassured when she boarded the plane with her children. Since 45 of the 60 people on the aircraft were school children traveling to Spain for what looked to be an enjoyable vacation, this was too valuable to let go. Meanwhile, Vitaly Kaloyev waited impatiently for his family to arrive at Barcelona's El Prat airport. He remained silent for a long while. He was still waiting on July 2nd, early in the morning. His family was still missing, and he was not receiving a response from anyone at the desk. Still, Vitaly went with patience. The nearly empty airport arrival lounge started to fill up with people, while he sat by himself, staring tiredly at the flight information board. But these were different from the travelers he had anticipated. The group of people there was unusual, consisting of reporters, journalists, and a camera team. They were asking questions from all directions to the airport employees. Vitaly found this perplexing, as he could not distinguish words from the resulting cacophony. Even worse, Vitaly stood out like a sore thumb because he was still waiting on his family, and it didn't take long for one of those reporters to connect his confused expression of wonder and concern with the circumstances that would come to light. The cameraman followed closely behind the reporter as they hurried to ask Vitaly if he was waiting for an aircraft from Moscow to arrive. In response, he said, "Yes." The reporter then discreetly expressed her sympathies to Vitaly, which further perplexed him. Why did he ask her? "Oh, they didn't tell you?" The same passenger plane that carried Vitaly's entire family, Val Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937, crashed in midair on July 1st, 2002, above Überlingen, a town in southern Germany on Lake Constance close to the Swiss border, with DHL Flight 611, a Boeing 757 freight jet. The 45 school children were among the 71 passengers and crew members who perished. Known for his calm, stoic manner, Vitaly started to lose his cool, but he forced optimism to rise even as terror ate into his very being. Taking action against his dread, he found the earliest flight to Zürich, Switzerland, less than 2 hours' drive from Lake Constance. He was going to the crash scene. Vitaly paced about the cabin the whole flight, trying not to panic, repeatedly telling himself that the journalist's account of the news was much more than it was. Little Diana, Konstantin, and Svetlana were all well. They had to be all right. There was nothing else to do. In the end, it was the media. It was well known that journalists would say or do anything to get a vast story. When Vitaly landed in Zurich, he caught the next taxi to the southern German border and headed to the disaster site. As Vitaly approached the crash scene, two things were clear to him. To start with, the sky was growing darker, and secondly, the stink of burnt metal was rapidly settling into the air around him. And if all that wasn't enough to kill a man in his circumstances, there also started to appear enormous pieces of broken metal all over the roads. It was a horrifying scene. Upon arriving at the disaster site, Vitaly became extremely upset upon witnessing the burned fields and the victims being removed from the crash zone. Upon realizing that Vitaly had ties to a few crash victims, the police attempted to talk him out of participating in the search. Vitaly, though, was unrelenting. He was unable to resist. Until he had personally seen his wife and children, his thoughts would not stop. Thus, he persuaded the commanding authorities to permit him to search for his family. The passenger cabin had burned to a skeleton mess, half its original size. Rescue personnel have been reaching into the debris to extract the occupants' remains. However, there was an issue once more. The plane had split in midair as a result of the crash, ejecting at least 40 passengers before it even made it to the ground. Thus, the reality of Kaloyev's family's fate became even more horrifying when the rescue personnel were unable to locate them among the debris. A farmer's daughter discovered the body of a small child in a pink dress the following day. Trees had broken her fall, so her corpse was still mostly intact. She described herself as Vitaly's daughter, Diana Kaloyev. Vitaly shed a childlike cry. There were white beads everywhere where he went to look for his daughter, and bits and pieces of a pearl necklace he had given his daughter on one of his 2-year-long visits home. She had fallen so tragically that the necklace was broken. After finding 8 beads, Vitaly vowed to keep them with him, wrap them in his handkerchief, and put them in his left breast pocket. Not too long afterward, the remnants of the impoverished youngster, Konstantin, age 10, were discovered beside a bus stop on a rural road. After crashing into the pavement, Vitaly continuously bashed his head against the wall till he bled, until he saw his son's body at the morgue. Because they thought Vitaly was about to commit suicide, the staff on duty had to call the police to get him. Finding his wife, Svetlana, brought Vitaly's grief full circle. Though fate had been unkind and left her dead in a cornfield, he had promised her the gardens of Spain. Or was it destiny? Two planes rarely crash into each other. It happens so infrequently that when it does, it's usually the direct consequence of human error. A specific number of individuals were in charge of both planes that fatal night. Which one of them was at fault then? A sorrowful mob from his local community, which had assisted in raising his children, greeted Vitaly Kaloyev as he escorted the coffins of his family home to Russia as the media was discussing this issue. People didn't realize how much Vitaly would suffer from the loss of his family, even if it were inevitable. Vitaly held a moving funeral for his family on the 3rd day following his return to Russia. While most headstones had names and numbers, Vitaly had a joyful photo of his wife and 2 children. It was a sign of impending relief and present suffering for the majority. Looking back, everyone ought to have seen this as a call for assistance, particularly when he expressed his inability to continue living during the funeral. In the month that followed, Vitaly cut himself off from everyone as he continued to grieve over his family. "I just cannot exist." He slept there for a few nights beside his family's tombstone. Vitaly hesitated to shave since the stress of his bereavement made his face wrinkled and his hair gray, giving him an older appearance. During the short time he spent at his now vacant 3-story mansion, Vitaly could not bring himself to enter Konstantin and little Diana's rooms on the 2nd or 3rd level because of the haunting memories the house still contained. He slept on a kitchen couch instead, and he dreamed severely. Dreams that would jolt him out of sleep at midnight and send him running to the cemetery, where he would reassure his young daughter, Diana, "Don't worry, my angel. Papa is here." He ultimately worked up the guts to go upstairs and made his family a shrine in one of the rooms. He arranged all their artifacts in the room on the beds Svetlana, Konstantin, and little Diana had occupied. He arranged young Diana's dolls, Konstantin's favorite toys, his wife's outfits, and her favorite fragrances. By now it is evident that Vitaly was going insane from the devastation he had experienced. Meanwhile, the German Federal Bureau of Aircraft Accident Investigation has taken the lead in investigating what caused the deadly disaster. The first assumption was, not unexpectedly, that one of the pilots had to have lost control in midair and steered their plane toward the other. Nevertheless, nothing revealed during the Tupolev and Boeing crew members' post-mortem investigations suggested that any of them had a medical history, physical limitations, or psychiatric disorders that might have contributed to the disaster. They thus performed tests to check for the presence of drugs, alcohol, or medication, but they too always yielded negative findings. Everyone on both flights operated at maximum capacity on the night of the tragedy. The final point of contention was tiredness, but it was also disregarded because it was found that the crew members needed more time to unwind and rest before their flights. What about natural phenomena like the weather? The German Meteorological Service, however, stated that the evening of July 1st was uneventful, with sporadic clouds and light to moderate rain. That evening, the crews of several airplanes that flew over southern Germany reported seeing stars, which was a clear sign of mid-level visibility. The moon was, however, in its waning phase and had not yet risen at the time of the crash. The sky was exceptionally gloomy at the moment of the incident because there had been a documented absence of moonlight throughout that period. Even with anti-collision devices installed and their eyes intended to be on the ground, this was still insufficient justification for experienced pilots to crash their massive aircraft. Following these first inquiries, the focus turned from the pilots and airlines to Skyguide, a private Swiss corporation. Both aircraft were being monitored by Skyguide, a Swiss air navigation service provider entrusted with monitoring the airspace over Lake Constance on the sad night of the collision. The primary responsibility of this multi-million-dollar corporation, which was based at Zürich International Airport, was to ensure that a crash like this wouldn't occur. Skyguide had previously asserted its innocence and declined to apologize to the victims. Thus, Skyguide provided investigators with their version of events when they started talking to the employees on duty that July 1st night. I'll give a brief overview while preserving the most crucial information. On the fatal night of the disaster, a Skyguide air control officer looked at a navigation radar screen that provided a digital overhead view of the Swiss airspace and its environs at about 9:30. There were also a few flashing dots on this navigation radar screen that indicated the flight number, destination, altitude, approximate speed of the aircraft, and its position in the sky. At that moment, air traffic control detected that the passenger jet and the DHL flight's blips were swiftly approaching the same position over Lake Constance while flying at 3,600 feet. The air control officer knew they would crash if they kept traveling in this direction. Thus, in accordance with Skyguide, the air traffic controller communicated with the passenger jet by radio, instructing its pilot to lower his aircraft by 1,000 feet, as per protocol. Air traffic control did not communicate by radio with the DHL Boeing aircraft. All that was required for both flights to pass safely was to get out of the other's way. That was all there was to it. Interestingly, the passenger jet Tupolev remained silent. The controller reiterated his request, stressing it more this time. After a while, the pilot's voice was audible over the radio, confirming the controller's confirmation of the descent order. As per Skyguide, the controller believed that the crew of the Tupolev passenger plane had completed the descent and therefore avoided a problem. The staff at Skyguide didn't recognize something was wrong until the blips of both flights, the Tupolev and the DHL, suddenly vanished from the navigation radar screen, and there was a complete lack of response to any attempts to radio the Tupolev cockpit crew again. Skyguide was putting the onus back on the pilots with this statement. They said neither their company nor the responsible air traffic controller was at fault. Skyguide was well known, but who exactly was this air traffic controller? By now, the media had also moved the blame from the airline and the pilots to Skyguide. More precisely, the responsible air traffic controller. But nobody was able to get a name. In addition, the public was not allowed access to the still open probe. Thus, nothing remained for the victims' relatives. Meanwhile, Vitaly Kaloyev, who had been attentively watching the news, concluded that Skyguide was to blame for the disaster that claimed his family's lives. Specifically, it was the air traffic controller's responsibility to prevent that catastrophe. Furthermore, Vitaly desired accountability for the disaster. He was mainly looking for an apology. At the memorial service conducted precisely 1 year after the tragic event, Vitaly Kaloyev was there. You would never have known this man if you had seen him. His unruly beard framed his face and revealed only a frigid expression. Officials from Skyguide and Alan Rosser, the CEO, were present. Vitaly's chance was now. Vitaly approached Alan in front of everyone, took him by the shoulder, and showed him pictures of his two kids, Konstantin and Diana, resting in caskets. Vitaly cried out, "You killed my children, and you do not want to talk to me?" as Alan's bodyguards grabbed him. With all the media present, Alan decided that the last thing he wanted was Skyguide to have another PR meltdown. So he invited Vitaly to Skyguide's office the next day so that he could ask questions in an open forum. However, Vitaly remained steadfast and insisted on finding out if the air traffic controller in charge the night of the collision would be there. Alan, though, declined to respond. Alan also declined to respond when Vitaly asked him his name. Vitaly showed up at Skyguide's corporate headquarters the next day to speak with Alan Rosser. There, he discovered that the air traffic controller was on vacation and would not be available. Vitaly was dissatisfied as they again refused to reveal the man's name. To further complicate things, he discovered that Skyguide was still hiring the air traffic controller. Vitaly saw this as the company's deliberate attempt to conceal the guy and prevent him from disclosing evidence that would reveal and establish Skyguide's responsibility for the collision that claimed his family's lives. Vitaly said that they were purchasing the man's silence by keeping him on staff. Naturally, Rossier refuted every accusation he made. Not surprisingly, he also declined to own up to Skyguide's mistakes or offer an apology to Vitaly, which only aggravated the already severe wound. A few days following the meeting, Vitaly received an offer from Skyguide's legal team to pay 60,000 Swiss francs in compensation for Svetlana's death and 50,000 for Konstantin and Diana's deaths. That's almost $98,000 for Svetlana and $81,000 for his children, adjusted for inflation. Vitaly would have to consent to not holding Skyguide accountable for his family's demise in exchange. It was an insult to Vitaly. Skyguide declined to accept accountability for the mishap. They'd refused to offer regrets for the lives lost. Additionally, they were purposefully concealing the air traffic controller, whom Vitaly believed to be the cause of the catastrophe that claimed his family's lives. They were now attempting to use the money to purchase his silence. Vitaly asked to meet with Rossier instead of accepting the offer. However, according to his attorney, the Skyguide CEO would no longer be holding meetings with the families of the accident victims. Thus, Vitaly decided to search for the air traffic controller independently. He employed a Moscow-based private investigator to locate the air traffic controller. The PI took 2 months to find the man's identity, family, and present whereabouts. Almost 2 years after the accident, in February 2004, the PI gave Vitaly Kaloyev an envelope containing images of the air traffic controller and his family. Peter Nielsen was his full name then, and he lived in Switzerland. Vitaly informed the investigator that he intended to provide the media with this information since he believed they had forgotten about the collision. He thought their curiosity would pique again if they found out who the actual air traffic controller was. However, this was untrue. Vitaly was not going to give the pictures to the media. Instead, he located a Swiss travel agency and requested that they reserve a hotel room for him near Zürich International Airport. On February 21, 2004, Vitaly touched down in Zurich. In barely 2 years, he had visited the nation twice for his family for the first time. He thought that this time was for the killer of his family. Peter Nielsen lived a short cab ride away from the suburban hotel. On February 24th, 3 days later, Vitaly wandered through the streets of Kloten until he came up against a structure. When he knocked on the first door, he saw a woman opening it and inquired whether he was looking for someone. The woman nodded and gestured toward the property when Vitaly greeted her and offered her a piece of paper with Peter Nielsen's name and address printed. A short while afterward, Vitaly entered Peter Nielsen's yard and sat close to his patio in a chair. When Peter Nielsen asked Vitaly who he was, he said, "I am Russia," as he came out of his home. Subsequently, Vitaly unfolded the packet he had carried with him, revealing horrific pictures of his kids' bodies. "What is Vitaly looking for from me?" Peter inquired. "You thought you could do this and go unpunished?" Vitaly asked, pressing the pictures into Peter's chest. If you saw your kids in caskets, how would it make you feel? Vitaly said that Peter swept the pictures aside, sending them fluttering to the ground, with a look of conceit and disdain in his eyes. Vitaly claimed that all he could recall when he watched those photos fall was an unsettling sensation, as though his children's bodies were toppling over in their graves. Subsequently, he claimed to have pulled out a knife before going completely dark. Peter Nielsen led to his death in front of his wife and kids in just 2 minutes. After throwing the murder weapon into a mound of snow on his way back to his hotel, Vitaly left the scene right away. He said that he was unaware of his bloody clothing until he got back to the motel. He then drank 2 bottles of vodka, showered, threw away his clothing, and napped after using part of the alcohol to wash the blood off his hands. Vitaly stated that he slept through the night for the first time since his family died. The police had taken Vitaly into custody by the following evening at approximately 5 o'clock. "It took you this long?" he allegedly said when he woke up to find them in his hotel room because he had not bothered to leave. Following his murder, Peter Nielsen's name could no longer be kept a secret due to the ensuing media frenzy. The public is now able to access it. Critical questioning of Vitaly was going on in the interim. He first denied going to Switzerland to kill Peter Nielsen. However, he eventually acknowledged confronting Peter outside of his home on the evening of February 24th after investigators pressed him with evidence of fingerprints, witnesses, testimony, blood tests, and the knife he had bought when he arrived in Zürich. He insisted he couldn't even recall what happened after the confrontation, only that he had lost control and had most likely killed Peter, but he still wouldn't confess to the crime. After Vitaly underwent a psychological assessment, a medical professional concluded that he posed a significant danger of suicide. He felt as though he had lost his direction. That following day, he was moved from police custody to a psychiatric facility. Authorities started debating whether he was even competent to face charges. Vitaly was permitted to leave his room and interact with the other patients in the clinic's common area. He observed them playing chess and backgammon there, but he never participated. Up until the day when Vitaly accepted a doctor's chess challenge, Vitaly defeated the doctor in 12 games, giving him the moniker Grandmaster and proving he was more than capable of facing justice for the killing of Peter Nielsen. However, as one might anticipate, another matter arose before Vitaly could go on trial. Finally, the 2002 Überlingen mid-flight crash inquiry ended in May 2004, only weeks before Vitaly's trial. The German Federal Bureau of Aircraft Accident Investigations published a full report. Peter Nielsen was the most prominent public opponent at the time. Everyone, even the victims' relatives, pointed the finger at him as the cause of the catastrophe. Although others disapproved of Vitaly's tactics, almost all concurred that his demise at the hands of Kaloyev was justifiable. But now that the investigation was over, everyone would have their understanding of reality wholly altered. What then exactly transpired that fateful July 1st, 2002 night? At precisely 5:50 p.m. on that fatal night, Peter Nielsen reported for duty at Zurich International Airport's Skyguide Air Traffic Control Center. There were frequently fewer aircraft flying through Swiss airspace during late shifts. Thus, Peter Nielsen and an unidentified coworker were the only 2 air traffic control personnel Skyguide had on duty that evening. They were both sitting at different workstations a few feet away from each other, obediently watching their radar screens. This is the point at which things started to go wrong. Around 9 o'clock at night, Peter's anonymous coworker decided to take a long break. In essence, he went to the staff lounge to slumber. He would frequently return in the morning after performing this act, leaving Peter to work alone through the night. Was this legal at this point? No. Did it violate any regulations governing international aviation? Without a doubt, did Skyguide and the Global Regulatory Agency miss it? Indeed, a few authorized technicians stopped by Peter's workstation 10 minutes after his colleague left for a nap, telling him they needed to schedule maintenance on the radar equipment in the control tower. It would take 6 hours to complete this operation, so they would essentially need to labor through the night and shut down the phone networks. It took this kind of invasive maintenance work to ensure there were no mishaps during the busiest days. The consequences of these specialists' failure to report for duty on a busy day readily overshadowed the seriousness of this invasive maintenance task. Peter had no choice but to obey. Peter should have realized, though, just how many technical aspects would be unavailable while the professionals worked on maintenance. He would also have yet to learn about the emergency that would arise in a matter of hours. Peter got a radio message at 9:25 p.m. from the pilot of Aeroloid Flight 1135, which was approaching the airport for a landing. The German city of Friedrichshafen is located along Lake Constance's northern shore. There had been unanticipated delays, which resulted in the flight landing later than expected. Peter had to leave his radar screen to watch this aircraft, so he went to his colleague's unmanned workstation and changed the screen to show the airspace around Friedrichshafen Airport. Friedrichshafen had closed its runways for the night at this hour. This meant that Peter would need to call them to get permission for the aircraft to land outside their regular business hours. However, there was an issue. Peter's phone was momentarily out of order due to an ongoing repair, so that he couldn't make the call. Unexpectedly, a new aircraft entering Swiss airspace reached Peter via radio. It was the pilot of Flight 2937 of Bashkirian Airlines, the same Tupolev passenger plane that carried Vitaly and his family. The Tupolev pilot identified his aircraft and described his flying altitude at 36,000 feet by radioing Skyguide's Area Control Center. The Aeroloid crew, anxious and keen to land as they made their final approach into Friedrichshafen, interrupted Peter when he returned to his workstation to acknowledge the Tupolev flight. The plane was not permitted to land since Peter had yet contacted Friedrichshafen Airport. Peter had experience managing several flights concurrently. The extra strain of working alone, the broken phones we just discussed, the need to physically switch between two radar screens, and his co-workers made his scenario special. Not surprisingly, Peter was getting overwhelmed very soon. He therefore concentrated on the duty he considered to be the most crucial, which was making sure the Aeroloid aircraft made a safe landing. Peter tried twice in the next few minutes to reach Friedrichshafen Airport, but his phone lines remained down, so neither attempt succeeded. Peter requested that the crew contact the airport directly over the radio, explaining to the Aeroloid cockpit that he could not establish a phone connection. The pilot gave a positive response. Meanwhile, an air traffic controller at Karlsruhe Airport in southwest Germany had detected danger on their radar screen. Two aircraft cruising at 36,000 feet were getting closer to the boundary between Germany and Switzerland. One was traveling north and the other west. The flight paths of DHL Cargo Flight, DHL 611, and Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937 would cross over Lake Constance in a matter of minutes, causing a collision. The controller at Karlsruhe Airport could not speak with either pilot directly, though, as international air traffic regulations applied to this specific airspace segment under Skyguide supervision. Instead, the controller tried to alert the Skyguide Area Control Center in Zürich about the approaching emergency, but they could not because Skyguide's phones remained down. Peter Nielsen had successfully navigated his colleague's radar screen to identify the Aeroloid flight. When he saw planes DHL 611, the freight jet, and BTCC 2973, the passenger jet from Tolpool, were headed straight for collision. He turned back to his radar. They were flying at the same altitude and getting closer to the same spot over southern Germany. Peter immediately radioed down to the Tupolev pilot, telling him to descend. He was unaware that the two planes' integrated traffic collision avoidance systems, or TCAS, were already resolving the urgent problem. The TCAS aboard the Tupolev told it to climb, while Peter told it to drop. Similarly, the DHL cargo jet's TCAS told its pilot to descend. Averting the collision would have been possible if the Tupolev pilot had disregarded Peter and followed his TCAS. Meanwhile, Peter's lines were down due to ongoing maintenance, so the DHL cargo jet could not reach him. It was a complete mess. In the dying moments, Peter misled the passenger jet into believing that the DHL flight was at 2 o'clock when in fact it was at 10. Thus, the Tupolev passenger plane started the descent, trusting Peter rather than his TCAS apparatus. The Aeroloid cockpit crew radioed in to indicate they had contacted Friedrichshafen Airport and had gotten permission to land just as Peter was about to lay back, feeling that he had finally stopped the situation. Peter walked from his desk to his colleague's radar screen to keep an eye on the landing. When Peter looked back at his radar screen 30 seconds later, at approximately 9:36 p.m., He saw the DHL freight plane and the Tupolev passenger jet abruptly vanish from view. It was too late when he attempted, and failed, to re-establish radio contact with the pilot he had been chatting with. The two aircraft had already collided. This comprehensive report established the cause of the crash as two things. Due to the many maintenance constraints surrounding his station that evening, Peter Nielsen quickly needed help recognizing the collision's risk. Instead, the Bashkirian pilot should have complied with the TCAS equipment's instructions. This was also not his responsibility because the pilots were not instructed to follow TCAS directions above air controllers until after the mid-flight accident. These results finally demonstrated that Skyguide's careless and almost unlawful rules allowing workers to take extended breaks were to blame. Überlingen's mid-air collision was not Peter Nielsen's fault directly. Probably, just like everyone else, he was a victim. When the public realized this, he was no longer seen as a criminal, but as a martyr, and messages of sympathy came in worldwide. These conclusions, however, had no bearing on Vitaly Kaloyev's prosecution. He was officially accused of killing Peter Nielsen on purpose. This offense fell between manslaughter and murder under Swiss law. It was not a surprise. Not everyone took it well, not least Vitaly's supporters. People disagreed over Vitaly's destiny, but could all agree that Skyguide should take responsibility for their part in the chaos. Vitaly Kaloyev was given an 8-year prison sentence after being found guilty of killing Peter Nielsen on purpose after just 2 days of trial. Devastated by the decision, Vitaly told the judge, "I'm accused of burying my children," and he would not go to trial. Why would I get up? In a mental hospital throughout the early part of his prison term, Vitaly Kaloyev spent his days pining to see his family's tomb. A Swiss prosecutor eventually brought 71 allegations of negligent manslaughter against 8 Skyguide employees, 2 years into his sentence and 4 years after the Überlingen mid-air disaster. Traffic supervisors, who were in charge of the area control center the night of the incident, were 4 people charged. Not surprisingly, the supervisors refuted any responsibility during that evidence, accusing Peter Nielsen and his unidentified colleague, the controllers on duty that evening, of acting unprofessionally. They further asserted that Peter handled the circumstances leading up to the crash poorly. Ultimately, 71 counts of negligent manslaughter were brought against the 4 Skyguide's air control managers. The managers received suspended sentences of 1 year for 3 and a fine of 150 Swiss francs, about $200 in today's money, for the 4th one. All 4 of the remaining Skyguide personnel received acquittals. You can only imagine the public's reaction and the victims' families' indignation. Although it was hardly the justice they had anticipated, this was the law. Less tragically, Skyguide eventually acknowledged complete liability for the 2002 Überlingen mid-air collision and extended financial support to the relatives of the 30 victims. Those who took legal action were compensated through an out-of-court settlement. At the time, the president of Switzerland formally apologized to Russia on behalf of his nation. Additionally, the German government issued an apology for ceding the sovereignty of a section of their airspace to a privately run Swiss corporation. In the meantime, Vitaly Kaloyev was sent to a medium-security jail where most of the convicts greeted him as a hero for his courageous act of retaliation. After only 3 years of his 8-year sentence, Vitaly was freed on November 8, 2007, thanks to lobbying by the Russian government, and was greeted as a hero by a large crowd of fans upon his homecoming. Journalists in his state recognized Vitaly as Man of the Year in 2008 when he moved back into his 3-story red brick home. He was named Deputy Minister of Construction of the Republic by the local administration and was in charge of numerous national and international construction projects. Until his retirement in January 2016, he was in that role. Vitaly's post-release life was largely uneventful. He didn't murder anyone to start with. However, he made an effort to begin again, got married again, and had children. When the Swiss government demanded that he pay back the expenses of his confinement, he became even more angry with them. He refused, and in 2012, because he was still on the watch list of the Swiss authorities, he was detained by German officials when he arrived in the nation to attend the memorial service commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Überlingen mid-air disaster. Vitaly was furious because he believed he had served his time and demonstrated his maturity as a member of society. The memorial had already passed when Russian diplomats succeeded in getting him freed. Just 1 day shy of turning 60 in 2016, Vitaly received the highest state medal, the Glory of Ossetia, an announcement that divided the people once more. Some people will always view him as a villain who violated the memory of his family by killing innocent people. Others will always view him as a hero who restored his family's name by enforcing justice in cases where the government failed. Now, after learning the specifics of Vitaly Kaloyev's narrative, people have one last question before we close this chapter. Is Vitaly Kaloyev sorry that he killed Peter Nielsen? Mainly because it has come to light that the air traffic controller was not the cause of his wife and children's deaths. I'll leave you with Vitaly's answer to the query, which you can probably guess. He's nobody to me. He was an idiot, and that's why he paid for it with his life. If he had been smarter, it wouldn't have been like this. If he had invited me into the house, the conversation would have happened in softer tones, and the tragedy might not have happened. I think about his children. They're growing up healthy, full of life. His wife is happy with her children. The grandparents are happy with the grandchildren. Who am I happy with? I don't really take offense to people who call me a murderer. People who say that would betray their own children, their own motherland. I protected the honor and the memory of my children. That was the case of Vitaly Kaloyev. I hope you enjoyed it and hope to see you in my next video. Thank you for watching.